behalf of the National Spiritual Assembly.
Well, thank you, dear friends. Does this work all right? Is it the right sort of height? Okay. If it doesn't, just wave or leap up and down or something, and I'll do what I can. When recalling these past years during today, it occurred to me once or twice to think how much the British Baha'i community has grown in that short time. When I left in 1961, I recollect there were about 800 Baha'is in the whole British Isles. And they were already not only operating 25 local spiritual assemblies, but directing the work in East and West Africa, and starting to think about the Pacific and all sorts of things, when they were in fact about the size of a normal non-denominational local congregation. But the faith obviously has much greater strength, as you see by that range of activities that they are undertaking. Now, just to see the size of the friends here and think of all the other friends out in the British Isles, it's a tremendous advance. What have been asked to talk about tonight is the Guardianship and the Universal House of Justice, which in a sense is a brief sort of outline of part of the history of the faith. I think history is vital for us to know and understand, but also to see ourselves as part of it. We can't divide life just quite rigidly into the past and the present and the future. Academically, maybe one has to. I remember when I was at university, one of my friends wanted to study the history of the First World War. And he was told by the professor of history that he couldn't do that. That wasn't history, that was current affairs. But really, current affairs is just a continuation of history. This was brought home to me in, I think it was in 1962, when we were commemorating the ascension of Baha'u'llah in Baden. And in those days, we would go out there in the evening, and we'd have a meal together, and then we'd spend the evening either dozing or walking around, and probably sitting talking, and then finally, and probably go to sleep for a while, finally in the morning hours have the commemoration of the ascension of Baha'u'llah. Well, that particular evening, while we were sitting around the table where we'd been eating, the hand of the cause, Mr. Samandari, who was there with us, said how moved he was to be there on that evening, because it was the first time he'd been in Baden on the night of the Ascension since it took place. And we realized he had been a pilgrim in the presence of Baha'u'llah when Baha'u'llah had ascended, and here he was sitting with us. That's how short Baha'i history is. This is just the year 162, am I right? Yes, that's right. And we're in the middle of the 2nd century. We're not, in Baha'i terms, in the middle of the beginning of the 21st century. We're in the middle of the 2nd century. We're at the springtime of the world. Now, we remember this when every Razwan we think of the declaration of Baha'u'llah. But we should think of it also as we look at the developments that have taken place in these recent decades. We're recalling today the visit of Abdul-Baha to the United Kingdom. And I don't think there are any Baha'is left here now who recall that visit, but there still were when I first became a Baha'i. There were one or two. Then it was following the passing of Abdul-Baha, when Shoghi Effendi was here in London, that he learnt of the death of Abdul-Baha and had returned to the Holy Land. He was a very young man. A lot of the Baha'is now are youth, and I think quite a lot of youth are here this evening. Just think what it must have meant to a young man of 25 to suddenly find himself in the position of the guardian of the cause of God, appointed that by his beloved grandfather, Abdul-Baha. It was a shattering experience for Shoghi Effendi. And it may not be. You think yourself, what would you do if suddenly you were told, look, here is the cause of God for 1,000 years. Look after it. Be the guardian of this cause. Protect it. Teach it. Build it. And that's what Shoghi Effendi faced. And he faced doing this with both tremendous positive assets and tremendous liabilities. Positively, there were many, many deeply devoted Baha'is around the world who rallied to him, who turned to him, as Abdul Baha had said, who just longed to do what he wanted, to do what he showed them for the advancement of this cause. It wasn't that they were starting from scratch, because Abdul Baha had already been talking to them. You had people like Martha Root, who went around the world. And you read the letters between Martha Root and Shoghi Effendi, and see this profound love that existed between them. And one must remember how small the Baha'i world was in those days, when Shoghi Effendi became the Guardian. It was a very small Baha'i world. And so there was an intimate, loving relationship among the true Baha'is in those days. There were also squabbles, as there are between human beings. I remember Hassan Balyuzi telling me about the early community in England. He said that they were real strong characters. They had to be Baha'is in those days. It wasn't easy for someone like Lady Blomfield to be a Baha'i. And he said but they so loved one another. He said they would come together and they'd fight like cat and dog, and then they'd go apart and do something, and then they couldn't. They just had to come together again. And but they had their strong ideas. They had only just begun to learn about the faith. They hadn't any of the letters of the Guardian. He'd just become Guardian. And they were strong characters, but they fought for the cause. They loved the cause. And they clung together. And this unity among the friends, and the love among the friends, and the idealism of the friends, their willingness to go out and sacrifice themselves, was what enabled the Guardian to build so much. But we shouldn't think it was easy for him, because he was faced with the most tremendous obstacles in the very early years of his guardianship. Some of the most prominent Baha'is turned against him. Avare, who was an outstanding teacher of the faith in Iran, thought he could tell the Guardian how to run the cause of God. Ahmad Sohrab, who was the secretary of Abdul Baha, didn't like the idea of the administrative order and did all he could to undermine it. Now, if you read some of the things that Ahmad Sohrab wrote, they sound, you may say, very reasonable in some ways. He showed his reasonableness in some ways reasonableness by the way he mistranslated some of Abdul Baha's talks. Sometimes when Abdul Baha would talk about the fear of God, Ahmad Sohrab would think that wasn't quite the thing people wanted to hear. He translated it as the love of God. This thinking one knows better than the center of the cause is the beginning of a rather slippery slope. But the Guardian had to face this. And right at the heart of the problems he had with his family was one Baha'i called Nayar Afnan, who had been accepted back into the faith after having broken the covenant. But he was there in the family. He was a descendant of Baha'u'llah. And there was a story I was told, I think it was by Hassan Sabri, about an early pilgrim, shortly after Shoghi Effendi became the Guardian, who was on pilgrimage, and he went to Bahji. And in Bahji he was met by Nayar Afnan, who lived in a little house, which is now between the shrine and the pilgrim house there. And Nayar said that, of course, Shoghi Effendi had been appointed in the will and testament of Abdul Baha, and they naturally had to obey Abdul Baha's will and testament. But Shoghi Effendi was really a very difficult person to work for. He was very impatient, and it was hard working for him. But of course, they had to obey the will. This horrified Mr. Sabri, that someone would say this about the Guardian. But he had his visit to Baha'i, and when he returned to Haifa, Shoghi Effendi asked if he'd visited Baha'i. He said yes. He said, "Did you see anybody there?" And he said, "Yes, Nayar Afnan." And did he say anything to you? And Mr. Sabri just couldn't say anything. He said, "Nothing particular." And then afterwards, later that night, he thought to himself, "What have I done? The Guardian asked me, did Nayar say anything? And I didn't tell him." So the next morning he was up at the crack of dawn to see the Guardian. And so he recounted what Nayar had said. And the Guardian said to him, "We must be grateful that he accepts the will and testament. What he said about me doesn't matter." Then later, the Guardian's sister, against his will, married Nayar Afnan. And Nayar Afnan gradually poisoned the whole family against the Guardian. And Ruhiyya Khanum recalled how when she was, shortly after she was married, the Guardian would sit with the members of his family and saying, "This Nayar, this Nayar, this Nayar, he will destroy you all, send him away." And they wouldn't. And that is what happened. That Nayar Afnan poisoned the minds of the members of Shoghi Effendi's family against him and caused them all to break the covenant. Now, I mention this now because it's the background at which you could see what Shoghi Effendi achieved. When you read these marvelous letters that he wrote to the West, the Baha'i administration, the World Order letters, his letters encouraging the Friends, all this outpouring of enthusiasm, of guidance, of love, was made against a background of criticism and barbs and problems caused to him by those who were closest to him. Now, I mentioned it now at the beginning because you should understand this. But this is not the fulfillment of everything. He had many problems. For example, shortly after he became Guardian, the followers of Mirza Muhammad Ali stole the keys of the shrine of Baha'u'llah. And here was this young man left trying to get the keys back. He eventually got them back. But these were the sort of things he was dealing with. But when you look at what he was doing with the whole Baha'i world, he wrote these fantastic letters, these marvelous letters to read. And it's good to read them through. Don't just dip into them. Get the Baha'i administration and the Advent of Divine Justice and the World Order letters and read them through. It may take quite a while, but you see the unfolding of his ideas. One night I was told by Leroy Iwas, his hand of the cause, that the Guardian said to him, "Leroy, do you think that when I became Guardian, I had this whole pattern of the administrative order laid out before me, and I began, as I thought best, to gradually unfold it to the Baha'is?" And Leroy said, "Well, yes, Shoghi Effendi, in fact, that's what I did think." He says, "It's not true." He said, "I didn't know. I just had to take one decision after another. Abdul Baha had said I would be guided, and I trusted Abdul Baha." So it wasn't the Shoghi Effendi had funny feelings inside that he was getting a guidance. Abdul Baha said he would be guided, so he had confidence in Abdul Baha that he would be guided. And when something needed deciding, he would decide it. And he would know it was right, and he would move on, and then the next stage would evolve. And he didn't hesitate to change his mind occasionally. This is where one has to understand that the manifestation of God and those that he leaves at the center of his faith are sensible people. And the Guardian appointed a language to be translated in the goals of the plan, and the National Assembly wrote back and said, "Shoghi Effendi, we've looked to find this language, but we're told it became extinct 2 generations ago." So he said, "All right, translate such and such a language." He didn't say, oh dear, I've made a mistake, I can't be infallible. He said, I said choose that, all right, doesn't work, choose another one. But he had a combination of great wisdom and great confidence and great humility and good common sense. And you see this comes out in all his writings. So I do ask you to make a point of reading through his writings. You may say it's difficult English. Well, in some ways it is, But that's because it's extremely good English. He says things clearly. He'll take a sentence of the Guardians. It seems a very long sentence, but in fact it's a constricted paragraph. He's got so many ideas in, and he used to write aloud. He said, Ruhiya Khanum said he liked to read aloud when he was writing. And sometimes this helps if you have any difficulty with the Guardian's writings. Read it aloud, because that's how he wrote it. And this is how it makes sense, how it links together. You may be able to make sense without reading it aloud, but it helps sometimes because you see the periods of the flow of his ideas. Now, doing this, the Guardian gradually built up the Baha'i world. He started with constructing the administrative order. Now, early on, he had wanted to call the election of the Universal House of Justice. And in fact, he gathered to Haifa a number of prominent Baha'is from around the world to consult about what could be done. And he came to the conclusion that it couldn't be done. It wasn't the time. It was premature. That first he had to build the groundwork on which the house could rest. So you see all his letters about the election of local assemblies, how local assemblies function, the spirit that has to suffuse consultation, and then the election of national assemblies, and how national assemblies function. All this business of administrative functioning was essential to the cause. Some Baha'is criticized him, said, well, why are you doing all this? What about the divine plan at Abdu'l-Baha? In fact, this is what Ahmad Sohrab said. He said, why are you talking about all this administration when Abdu'l-Baha's divine plan's there? Why don't you put it into effect? And the Guardian explained that he had to have instruments. Martha Root was the greatest teacher we've known, but very little remained of what she did because there was nothing to follow up. There was no structure. There were no local communities, no local spiritual assemblies, let alone national assemblies and committees and so on. So this is how the Guardian approached things, with the guidance of God. As I say, he told Leroy he didn't plan it from the beginning, but he just saw what he had to do at first, and he did it. And so for these number of years, he raised up the structure of the administration, and then began to implement the divine plan of Abdu'l-Baha. He started this series of great teaching plans. First of all, the first 7-year plan, when in America they had to establish assemblies in every state and every province of Canada and open Latin America. Then the second 7-year plan and the European teaching campaign. And in Britain, while in the second 7-year plan was going on, of course, he got various other countries joining in. And in Britain we had our 6-year plan. And that's when I had the good fortune to become a Baha'i, towards the end of the 6-year plan in 1950. And then the community was just humming. The pioneers had gone out all over the United Kingdom, established these assemblies, and they were very delicate things. I mean, you had to keep on re-pioneering to save the assemblies. And the National Assembly would send out almost weekly bulletins as the end of the plan approached that, 2 more gaps in this place, 3 gaps here. And the Friends would get up and pioneer, and eventually the 6-year plan was won. Just. With a tremendous effort. But it was a basis. All the time the Guardian would raise us up to establish a foundation on which we could move forward. And the British Baha'is had no sooner as it were taken a deep breath with accepting the idea of the completion of the 6-year plan, the Guardian opened the idea of the Africa campaign to their minds. It's one thing to pioneer from, London to Belfast or Dublin or something like this, but to pioneer to Africa? And many of the pioneers, if you talk to pioneers of the 10-year crusade, you'll hear a number of them hadn't the faintest idea where they were going. Iran Mahajer tells me that when she and Dr. Mahajer were to pioneer to Indonesia, she hadn't the foggiest idea where Indonesia was, let alone what it was like. And they went there. And these pioneers just arose and went out and scattered the faith all over the world. The Guardian used to talk often of the need for the diffusion of the faith first, and then the suffusion of the faith. So it spread it all over the world. And then in all these countries to deepen the depth of the spirit of the faith in those countries. And this is what has been going on. Having got these plans going, he was using his administration to send the faith out into the world. He continued the building of the administrative order. And one great astonishment to the Baha'i world was in 1951, when he appointed the first International Baha'i Council. Because in those days, remember, we just learned about local assemblies and national assemblies. And suddenly here was an international institution that he said was the embryo of the Universal House of Justice. Now, one thought of the House of Justice as being something way, way in the future. But then now this was, as it were, the foretaste, a sort of aperitif to the Baha'is. And we saw something beginning to function. Now, in the Holy Land, of course, this was also the Guardian getting some reliable helpers. For a long time, his helpers were his brothers and cousins, and they were the ones that turned against him. Until, of course, he had Ruhiyya Khanum. And she became his secretary. And there's this wonderful cable he wrote about her, that she was his shield against the covenant breakers, and his helpmeet in all his labors. And you can see that. And this is really another whole story, but I hope if Violette Nakhjavani comes again to London, she can tell you more about Ruhiyya Khanum, because she was the most extraordinary woman. Tremendous character, great love, great understanding, and profound humility. And she was there at the Guardian's right hand, helping him and writing his letters. And again, you see the smallness of the Baha'i world. You read the letters from Ruhiyya Khanum to the Secretary of the National Assembly of the British Isles. It was Dear John. John Ferriby was the secretary, so Ruhiyya Khanum calls him Dear John. Now, he would actually call her Ruhiyya Khanum, but even so, there was this closeness and this love between the friends. And so now we had some friends who were sent to Haifa. I remember in England, we were all astonished when suddenly we got this message to the National Assembly, ask Lotfullah Hakim to go to Haifa for services. Lotfullah Hakim was the descendant of, I think, the earliest Jewish Baha'i in the faith. And he'd been pioneering, he'd served Abu Baha, he was pioneering at this time in Edinburgh, I think. And so he went to Haifa, we didn't know why. And then there were two elderly ladies in America, the Rebel sisters, who were devoted Baha'is. They were called there too, the Jessie and Ethel. And they were two wonderful souls, small ladies, lovely sisters, but very different in character. Ruhiyya Khanum said once that there were two saints in Haifa. One was Ethel Ravel, the other was Alice Kidder. Alice Kidder was someone who was keeping as a companion for Ruhiyya Khanum at that time. But Ethel Ravel was that. She was a saint, absolutely a saint in every way, and had a very wry sense of humour. She always worked every day. If she got some job, she just worked till it's finished, and then she went to sleep, even if it was 2 o'clock in the morning. The next day was a new day, and she started again. When I was in pilgrimage, the last morning, I got up rather early to get ready to leave. And Ethel Ravel was up down the kitchen, already beginning to get breakfast. And she had one of her eyes didn't work properly with the other. It looked out a little bit. And so she tended to hold her head on one side. And as I came into the kitchen, she looked at me and said, "The early bird catches a worm. Who wants a worm anyway?" That was typical of Ethel. Jessie was quite a different character. She was a bulldog. She had the International Fund on her hands. In fact, she had it in a pink toffee tin. And she kept it in her room, and her room was the only room in that building that had a Yale lock on it, because she had the fund in there. And she would bargain for the faith. She was absolutely rigid in the defense of the faith. So these two sisters were there. And then gradually other members of the council. And we just got the idea of the council being called into being by the Guardian when the following December 51, he appointed the first living hands of the cause of God. Up till then, the only hands we'd ever thought of or heard of were ones from the time of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l Baha, or ones who'd been appointed posthumously. And clearly they were the most outstanding people, but the idea of actually having a hand of the cause of God in this world whom you could meet and talk to just never occurred to us. This was again something for the future. Suddenly, here were the hands of the cause appointed by the Guardian. This was such a thrill to the Baha'i world. And I remember one of the few I had met at that time was Hermann Grossman. And he seemed so obviously to be a hand. I mean, once he was appointed, I thought, oh, of course, that's what a hand is like. And these hands were appointed around the world. And the guy, this was still in 1951. And the Guardian had obviously started the building of the administrative order at the base, got the National Assemblies going, then suddenly started from the top on the appointed arm. And here's the Guardian was appointing his hands. And they had only been functioning, he appointed various other groups of hands afterwards. They'd only been functioning a short time. And he called upon them to appoint auxiliary board members. Now, no one had ever heard of auxiliary board members before then, but these helpers to the hands that they had to appoint. And some of the hands were asking him, whom should they appoint? He said, that's your job. I'm appointing you. You appoint your auxiliary board members. So this whole concept, which was quite new and very difficult for some Baha'is, because we'd got out of the way of thinking of certain Baha'is as being, kingpins. We got used to the institutions as being the authoritative bodies. And then suddenly to have individuals who had rank and status and advisory authority over assemblies rather jangled the brains of some friends. They found it rather difficult to accept. Because we hadn't got used to this idea. This administrative order has this side of appointed persons, the hands of the cause and their auxiliary board members, doing certain functions which are different from the sort of functions we're used to in other religions. They're not a clergy. Very different. And yet they are, the Guardian in the dispensation describes these different elements of the Baha'i administration. And that again is a thing to read through very carefully. For example, he has the principle of democracy, which is evident there in the methods of election. There's the principle of monarchy, which in a sense is the Guardian and his appointees. And then there's the function, quality of aristocracy. Now, some friends thought, the aristocrats, their hands, but that's not it. The principle of aristocracy appears in the responsibility of spiritual assemblies and their members to decide what they believe is right, not what they think the people will want. Assemblies are responsible to consult the Baha'is, to find out what the Baha'is think, to find out what they need. But their authority is to God, to decide what by conscience they believe is right. Now this is what aristocracy means. It's the principle of our election of bodies. An aristocrat is the rule of the best. Aristocracy means the best. So the principle of Baha'i election is for the believers to elect the best. Now they're not going to be marvelous. We're all human beings. But that's the aristocratic principle, that we shouldn't appoint people that we think have to do what we believe. The sovereign is not the people. The sovereign is God. This is the kingdom of God on earth, not the republic of God on earth. And when we elect our spiritual assemblies, we are electing those whom we feel are best, whom we will obey, whom we can consult, whom we can advise, but whom we will obey. This is the aristocratic principle in the faith. And it's interesting how the hands did this when they came to deal with the House of Justice, but I'll come on to that later. Now, the Guardian had been building all this, and so we had this vision of the plan, the 10-year crusade going ahead, when he suddenly passed away. And this was a most tremendous blow to the Baha'i world. He was young. About 61, I think, was he when he died? And we loved the Guardian so intensely. And as I say, it was a small world. And there were many Baha'is who'd met the Guardian, as I had the bounty of doing. And he was such a considerate person, so full of enthusiasm, and he had majesty. I mean, you would never sort of, underestimate the stature of the Guardian, but he was so loving. I was a British pilgrim, and he welcomed me, and then the first thing he started talking about was the weather. He knew the British people talked about the weather. But he, in the way that he welcomed the pilgrims, he actually, I learned later from Rahir Khanum, had solved the problem. And I'm going to mention this because it's an example of how the Guardian, with his humility, solved problems. The problem was this, that the pilgrims used to be gathered, and the Guardian would come in to meet them. Now, as you know, in Western society, ladies do not stand up when men come into the room. So, some of the Western ladies, when the Guardian came in, would continue sitting down and sort of hold up their hand to be shaken and say, "How do you do, Sheikh Effendi?" And he couldn't permit this. To start with, it was too terrible a test for the Oriental Baha'is. And for anybody else who saw it, it was not he couldn't allow that to happen. But he didn't issue an instruction that when the Guardian comes in, will everybody please stand up, including the ladies? He so arranged it that in future, he was in the room first. And then the pilgrims came in. So, of course, they were standing up. I mean, you don't come in sitting down. And then he could welcome them and show them to their seats and be a perfect host and settle you down. This is the sort of way he solved problems. But he could, of course, be angry sometimes, because he was a human being. He himself said he wasn't the exemplar of Baha'i life. Abdul Baha was that. I think Abdul Baha also could be angry from time to time, and I'm sure Baha'u'llah also. But the degree of love, you may say, reached its peak in the manifestation of God. Rahir Khanum told me that when she became a Baha'i, her only near experience with Abdul Baha, and she asked one of the members of the Holy Family, "Was Baha'u'llah really as loving as Abdul Baha was?" And this member of the family said, "Oh, compared with Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha wasn't loving at all." So we get a little glimpse of the degree of the qualities of the manifestation of God. At any rate, when the Guardian was angry, Rahir Khanum says you could feel the whole house shake. He was angry. But he usually wasn't angry with pilgrims. He was so loving, so understanding, so interested in the pilgrims. He could see the genuineness of the character. One of the things I was frightened about when I went on pilgrimage was I had a sneaking feeling that the Guardian could see right through me. He would know what I was like. And that is a very uncomfortable feeling in relation to anybody. And if it's the Guardian of the cause of God, it's extremely uncomfortable. The resolution of that was to learn that that's exactly what he did. He knew you. But the consolation was that the flaws he just ignored. That's not what he was interested in. All right, you had flaws, he knew those. What he wanted was any possibilities that he could do something with. Any possibilities for capacity, which he would encourage. And that's so with many pilgrims had this similar experience. So he had this positive effect on the friends and aroused their great love and affection. So the friends loved the Guardian very, very dearly. When he passed away, it wasn't just the loss of the Guardian, it was the loss of Sheikh Effendi. So we had this funeral in London, and Rahir Khanum was here, and she comforted the friends, and she rallied the hands and took them back to Haifa. And then we had this wonderful message that the hands sent out. And they took forward the whole 10-year crusade to a victorious conclusion. The Guardian had been very worried by the midpoint of the crusade, that things were dying down. They'd had the outflow of pioneers. And he spoke to two lots of pilgrims in different ways. He said this to several groups of pilgrims. But to one group of pilgrims, he said, "I called upon them to pioneer and they wouldn't go. I called upon them to disperse and they wouldn't go." It was the next thing he said, oh yes, sorry, yes, so personally wouldn't go. He said, "They will leave as refugees." So those were three things. Then the other people, he said, "I called upon them to pioneer and they wouldn't go. I called upon them to disperse and they wouldn't go. I will not call upon them again." And of course, then when the Guardian passed away and the hands reminded the Baha'is of the goals of the 10-year crusade, the whole Baha'i world rose up and the crusade was won. Then with the winning of the crusade, you had the wonderful Congress here. And then the House of Justice had been elected. And this is where the House of Justice comes into the picture. Sorry, I think I'm going a bit too long. I'll have to be careful. But the House of Justice was faced with this situation once it was elected. What happens to the guardianship? There had been some disagreement among the friends. Some said, obviously, the will and testament says how guardians to be appointed. You can't do it, as there can't be any guardian. The others were saying, obviously, there must be a guardian. It's part of the whole administrative order. There must be a guardian, you see. The hands very wisely said, stop speculating. That's not your business. Only the House of Justice can give an answer. And I remember when the French NSA wrote the covenant, when Mason Remy wrote the covenant, the French NSA followed him. Mr. Fazey came back to Europe afterwards, after the new NSA had been elected. And he told all the friends, he said, the House of Justice is shortly coming into existence. Beware, don't form any preconceived conceptions of what the House of Justice will decide, or you will test yourself. Be ready for whatever it decides. Now this, of course, from the point of view of the House of Justice, was a tremendous problem. The will and testament, you see, doesn't say how a guardian is to be appointed. The will and testament says, first of all, about Shoghi Effendi, that Shoghi Effendi will be succeeded by the firstborn of his lineal descendants. Now, one problem is, what do they mean by lineal? Is it only his children and their descendants, or does it include the other branches, the collateral branches? We don't know. We never had to answer the questions, but that's in the air. Then there was later on that the guardian must appoint his successor in his lifetime. And this choice is to be approved by the 9 hands in the Holy Land. Okay. And if the guardian's eldest son doesn't fulfill the spiritual qualities of appointment, he should choose another branch and appoint another branch. It says nothing about what the guardian should do if it turns out that all his sons are hopeless, or if there's no one he could appoint, which is what happened. The guardian had no sons. Shoghi Effendi had no sons, and all his brothers and sisters and cousins had broken the covenant. There was no branch for him to appoint. And people asked why the guardian didn't say anything about this. And the House of Justice, in one of its letters, says we should understand this as an example of the infallibility of the guardian. If you look at the way he explains the will of the testament, it's quite clear that the guardian's function is interpretation of the sacred texts. He interprets the faith, he defends the faith. He does not legislate on what the text leaves open. And he was to stress he didn't do this. Even with the Declaration of Trust and Bylaws of National Spiritual Assemblies, he got the American National Assembly to formulate and enact the Declaration of Trust and Bylaws with his soul-shaking hints interwoven. But he didn't legislate them. He got a National House of Justice to make this law, the Namus Akbar. It wasn't for him to say what the friends do when the will of testament leaves something uncovered. He says enough is the will and testament in the House of Justice. He'd said that to friends when they were worried. He says, you've got enough. And that's what he did. He couldn't say anything. It wasn't interpretive. He didn't say it. But then the House of Justice was faced with the problem, what do we have to do? Are we given this function of legislation just so that in such a situation we can appoint a successor? Or we can make a law that how a successor can be appointed for Shoghi Effendi? Is that why we have this authority? Or is that something way beyond our capacity? That we shouldn't do that? That it would be a breach of our authority to do that? And this consultation had to go on, and we consulted the hands, and we know exactly what the House of Justice decided eventually. They could not appoint a successor to Shoghi Effendi, and it couldn't legislate to make it possible to appoint a successor for Shoghi Effendi. That is what it decided, and it's all it decided. Don't go extrapolating this with their own understandings. We are not interpreters of the cause, any of us. The House of Justice is not the interpreter of the cause. It's not a prophet. It stated what it decided, and we know what it is. Later, when friends asked questions, it explained how this didn't undermine the covenant, how the House of Justice's authority was clearly in the texts, and how it has enough. It can't interpret that. Authoritative interpretation is not there in the absence of the guardian. And because the hands had to be appointed by the guardian, you see, there it's different. It doesn't say how the guardian is to be appointed by his predecessor. It's how the guardian is to appoint his successor. But in the case of the hands, it doesn't say how hands are to be appointed. It does say how hands are to be appointed by the guardian. It's the opposite way around. So with no guardian, you can't appoint any hands. So the House of Justice then had to discuss this whole relationship between the House of Justice and the hands. Had it authority to tell them what to do in the absence of the guardian? Yes, it was the head of the faith. So it then developed its relationship with the hands. Then it was able to bring into being the boards of councillors, who are not hands. They perform some of the functions of the hands, and they are able to carry forward this whole side of teaching and protection in the faith that the hands had done. And so in all this work of filling in these gaps in the system, of reconstructing the system, the House of Justice was continually referring back to the texts of the Guardian and consulting the hands. It used to meet regularly every week with the hands of the cause in the Holy Land. And every time the hands had a conclave every year, it would meet with the hands of the conclave and discuss the next major decision to be made. So it was a very close interrelationship between the hands and the House of Justice. And that again has been a very sad experience over these past years, has been the passing of the hands. Two very serious events, or series of events, have, as it were, round the hearts of the members of the House of Justice. One is the persecutions in Iran, where we had to follow the advice of the friends in Iran and take their advice and follow the guidance of God as to what should be done in this situation, hoping, every hope and praying, that no action would precipitate worse situations. They would gradually take things forward. So far, the guidance seems to have been working, but the friends are still suffering very much in Iran. And this has been a burden on the House for many years. The other was the gradual loss of the hands of the cause. This whole institution which had been there, slowly individual hands passed away, some suddenly, some through old age, one through being murdered, Kalinga. And from the House of Justice members' point of view, of course, these were not just, you might say, high officers of the faith that we were losing. They were intimate friends that we wouldn't see anymore. And then, of course, the last of the passings was Untitled Chapter, who had been a tower of strength to the House of Justice all those years. She had served the Guardian with such incredible fidelity, and she just transferred that to the House of Justice. And just as she asked the Guardian questions, and she used to often tell about she's raising issues with the Guardian. In fact, I remember once at the table, one of the pilgrims said, Shoghi Effendi, when you said so-and-so, did you mean such and such? And Ruhi Khanum obviously thought the pilgrim was not saying quite sensible, and she intervened and said, oh no. And the Guardian turned to her and said, oh yes. And so this is in front of the pilgrims. The Guardian would discuss all sorts of things in front of the pilgrims. And there was this lovely relationship. He would, as it were, pull the leg of Ruhi Khanum occasionally. I won't go into details, but for example, she used to take little vitamin pills. He would comment about Americans being very fond of pills. But there's this tremendous, the freedom of expression and the absolute devotion which the Ruhi Khanum gave to the Guardian, she transferred to the House of Justice. Again and again, if she thought something was going wrong at the World Centre or something developing, she'd come and meet with the House of Justice and say what she thought and what she recommended be done. And then whatever the House of Justice decided, that was it. We went on with that. So that the loss of Ahmad al-Bahar was a tremendous blow to the House of Justice. But thank God we still have Dr. Vafa, one of the hands, who is in fact the occupant of the oldest institution in the whole Baha'i world order, the trustee of Hubble. And this is a vital institution, a very great institution, and Dr. Vafa is still with. But these years have seen this interrelationship between the Guardian and the House of Justice, and in the teaching work, of course, the House of Justice has carried forward what the Guardian did. And over these years, as it mentioned in a recent letter, the whole Baha'i world has been experimenting. And at last, we've been able to make a sort of condensation of the lessons of what to do right. And this is really what this present push of the faith is, this whole question of training institutes, of the base, the core curriculum, core thing, what are they called? activities, yes, sorry, I'm losing my memory, is a systematic approach to the teaching work, which the House of Justice has deduced from the successes of the Friends in their experimentation with the work. That is why now I think things are beginning to go forward so fast, that this is the House of Justice interaction, you must say it's spiritual conversation with the Baha'i world of how things are done. And as the Baha'i world responds, then we can see the faith going faster and faster forward. And this is the same pattern as the Guardian followed. And what the future will hold, we don't know. But we can be quite certain the covenant is strong, the covenant is there. And as we had a Guardian for 36 years without a House of Justice with him. Well, now we have the House of Justice maybe for another 800,000 years without the Guardian. I don't know how long. It's not our business. That's God's business. But at the present, we have the House of Justice, and that is quite enough to enable the Baha'is to build the world order of Baha'u'llah.